Peter Levin, your 55th time in Finland.
Indeed.
Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Mishka, appreciate it.
Yeah, so Peter, you're a co-founder and managing director at Griffin Gaming Partners, the biggest fund in gaming per size, $1 billion. And that's interesting. But then also I want to talk about like how come you've been in Finland for 55 times. And then you told me just before the start of the podcast that you represented all the top MMA fighters. So I don't know where to start.
You tell me where we want to start pulling this thread.
Most of our audience is not interested in MMA, so that could be part.
Do that later. That could be offline.
That's a different podcast.
Yeah.
But you being 55 times in Finland, that must be a record.
I don't know if it's a record. I do know, as we've talked about before, when I started coming here, when I was on the board of Sulake, and for those of you OG Finnish gaming folks know that Sulake was their big title was Habbo Hotel, which was, I think, the first virtual world of its kind for teens and kids, kind of pre-Club Penguin. And I was put on that board by Balderton, or Benchmark Europe at the time. And then I was coming out here every 8 weeks for 5-ish years. And the Finns, they were pretty regimented about those board meetings. And so I would hop on over on Lufthansa or Finnair.
Yeah.
And I think it was about my 40th-ish trip where I had to get that extension to your passport, where you got to go and they staple on an addendum to it. And at that time, I was going to Japan a lot for the MMA stuff. I was going to Finland a lot for Sulake and then other things over the years. And we can maybe touch on that, Rovio and spending a lot of time with our mutual friend Teemu Huttinen, who I did most of this stuff with. But about that time when I got the extension put on the passport, that's when I started counting.
Yeah.
And I was right around 40-ish. I was like, okay, I'm going to count from this point forward. And I'd been to every slush, except for, I think, 1 or 2 in the last few years.
Yeah.
We had other team members go and I was conflicted out. And so it adds up, but I do consider it my home away from home.
That's awesome. Now you mentioned Japan. I want to talk about pride, but I'm going to not talk about
we can
pride.
go deep on pride.
No. Okay. So let's talk about shit.
There is a subset of our cohort that likes MMA and gaming, and it's a shame that there really hasn't been a great MMA game.
Yeah, that's true.
It is a shame.
EA has not done a great job.
They do a great job marketing it.
Yes.
I mean, Dana does a phenomenal job marketing it.
Best promoter.
But the game isn't great.
No.
And that is a shame.
Yes. All right. So even though I don't I'd prefer that avenue. Let's go back to
we're off topic fast.
Yes. So let's talk about Sulake, and let's talk about so you were with Rovio board or what's your connection with Rovio as well?
Well, when I started spending a ton of time over here with Sulake, and at the time, one of the things that I did as an active board member, they were very interested in collaborating with third-party intellectual property. And they wanted to do that geography by geography and then macro to the Sulake, to the Habbo Hotel platform. And I just fell in love with the aesthetics. You remember the game? It was a very unique aesthetic.
So 8-bit type of...
8-bit plus.
Yes.
And they had these wonderful mini games. I remember the snowball fight. And but it was unlike anything we had seen in market. We had seen a lot come from Asia with Nexon and their products. We had seen Club Penguin once it entered the market. But again, and we can get to this too, but the content and the intellectual property and the aesthetic, the unique aesthetic that was coming out of Finland was something unique. And so one of the things they wanted to do was partner with third-party intellectual property. And at the time, the 2 biggest pieces of IP really in the world from a film standpoint and a publishing standpoint, it was Twilight. If you remember, it was...
Oh, I do.
Yeah.
I do.
Right? You couldn't go to a pool or be on a plane without people reading Twilight.
Yes.
and then on the television side, it was American Idol. And they were taking that format and they were pushing it out all over the world. And so I helped them directly and indirectly bring Twilight and American Idol onto the platform. And so we put partnerships in place with, at the time, the studio that owned Twilight. And then with the production company that had the rights to American Idol. And so I spent a ton of time during my board tenure putting relationships in place, putting discussions in place, helped manage their relationships and partnerships with folks like Disney and some of the leagues. NFL, I remember we were having a bunch of conversations. And so being so proximate to this market and spending so much time here, as you know, it's small.
Very.
It's a super fraternal market. And I remember flying over for a board meeting with Teemu Huttinen, who at the time was living in the States. He was living in Hermosa Beach. A shout out to her Hermosa boys.
I thought it was Manhattan Beach, but that's close.
Oh, dude, no. You don't want to go there. It is close, but so far away culturally. And so he and I would fly over for board meetings at times, and he said, you got to play this game. It is blowing up in Northern Europe, and it was Angry Birds. And this was really before it was a thing. And then for the next 7 hours, we were just on the plane. I remember, passing the phone back and forth, talking a lot of smack. And I said, hey, let's meet with the guys while I'm there. And so I met with Mikael and Niklas, and we spent time. And they said, hey, the things that you can do and the waters that you can help us navigate over there, we would love it if you would be an advisor. And Teemu signed on to be an advisor as well. So that was a bonus to be able to do yet another thing with him, as I served on the board of Sulake. And so from that meeting, in the next, I think, probably 6 to 8 weeks, it became Angry Birds.
Yes.
And I remember they came out for their first E3 in Los Angeles, and they were the kings of the court. Everyone wanted a meeting with them, and it became a very hands-on advisory role. I actually helped shape and put in place the individual and the platform that shaped their licensing and merchandise program globally, which within a year of that being put in place, that was $1 billion licensing and merchandise program. It was amazing.
I vaguely remember those times, 2012, 2013. I remember when Dan would join Rovio, I was working already there. He doesn't remember. I was just lowly monetization manager, so he doesn't remember that. But I remember him. He got the nice office and everything. So
yeah, although monetization office, that's where it's at, and that's. I hope he treated you well.
Oh yeah, they did. Shout out to Rovio. You've heard of Heroic Labs by now, and we keep talking about them because you need every edge to be successful in today's market. Heroic Labs game stack is built like a brick house. You got the Nakama, their backend game server, Hero, their game development framework, Satori, their live op service, and last but not least, Heroic Cloud to provide massive scalability. Heroic Labs is a battle-tested partner, and their tech enables you to be flexible, creative, and scale for success. Focus on your game, avoid tech risks, grow your product with scalable live ops, and save a big chunk of cheese, all with Heroic Labs. Two avenues we can go to. I really want to talk about IPs and transmedia because that you're the OG of IPs and transmedia, I would say. So, but let's park that a little bit because while we're still in Finland, talking about Finland, like, what do you think makes Finnish gaming companies successful, and vice versa? What do you think they are lacking in the current environment that has, it has changed quite a lot from the early mobile days to 2024, where we are right now?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's certainly some things early on that led to, an incredibly small country, relatively speaking, thriving the way it has in gaming. They're like it's like when you watch Norway in the Winter Olympics, right? And they're just cleaning up all the medals, and it's like 7.5 million people. I think there was a confluence of events that led to some of this early on, and I think a lot of it had to do with the early DNA at Nokia. When you had, they were really the first, handset manufacturer that looked at this device as something other than something just to make phone calls with, right? You remember when the Series 40 and Series 60, you had Snake.
Oh, yes, I do. 3310 was, I think, the phone that introduced it. I quite remember those.
So point is, I think they were the only ones that you could have a sophisticated conversation early on about that. And then again, I think you couple that to some of the, the early DNA in market that was wildly successful. Relatively speaking, at the time, Sulake was a big deal globally in terms of that virtual world space. Clearly, Remedy, stood out. And then you had folks exiting environments like Nokia and Sulake, and either starting up their own companies or starting to teach at university. And I feel like in these somewhat self-contained smaller markets, you have to from go contemplate how your product is going to work globally, because your market locally isn't enough to sustain it, right? So if you look at markets like Israel, if you look at markets like Turkey or Korea or Australia and other form factors of media, they're subscale. And so they can't develop a product necessarily that can only work in their own backyard. And so from go, their orientation towards go-to-market is, hey, this has to work globally. And I do think that that's something that is advantageous to smaller markets. I also think you've got to learn early on how to play well with others, because you're not the market the size of China, right? And so you're going to have to figure out, well, how do I create marketing partnerships and publishing partnerships and localization and culturalization of my games, in these markets. But what I've loved from early on is the conviction. They are stoic and they are driven. And it's not an arrogance. I don't think there's a hubris to it. I just think there's don't really tell us that we can't do something. There's a lot of white space out there. And we're going to try to figure it out. And I've loved that about, the Finnish entrepreneurial spirit. There's no getting in their way. Now, when presented with a better set of data, they will pivot too, which, I respect, right? Because if you can't move off a position when presented with a better set of data, then I have issue with it. But I do think that they're able to do that. There's an ambulatory nature to what they've done. I mean, I think Supercell is the best in the world at that. They will take something to the nth degree, and if it doesn't work, they will put it on a shelf. And they have had more discipline doing that than anyone within the industry. I mean, the entire industry looks at them, as the North Star of that.
Yeah, the interesting 3 points, like basically that Nokia DNA, I would say working with a small screen has become an advantage for these companies. I worked at Digital Chocolate. That was my start of my career.
God, yeah.
So it was, doing games for Engage and so forth. I wasn't part of that. I came in when the company was transitioning from the feature phones to web-based games, and then back on the phones when in-app purchases were allowed on iOS, and that created the whole new industry. But yes, that's sort of a background of not pushing high production values because people were used to these incredible limitations became advantages on a new platform. So I would say that's definitely the Nokia DNA was huge. Global from the start, that was an interesting point that you made, because I remember I was coming out of the business school. I was still studying when I started at Digital Chocolate, and I felt...
Their offices here?
Digital Chocolate?
Yeah.
Yeah, there were...
No, I know they did have them there, but they had multiple offices, but you were in the office here.
Yes, the Helsinki
That's a legendary office.
Yes, the Helsinki office that became essentially Supercell.
Yeah.
And the Barcelona office became Barcelona King afterwards. So yeah, those are kind of like the two main offices. Right. But yeah, I remember that global from the start, because you're studying in a business school, you're reading about all these cool companies, most of them American and so forth. And then you realize that you're in the tiniest market of the world, 5 million people. Are you going to go and sell beer to 5 million people? When, you have these top brands selling to hundreds of millions or billions. Yeah. And no matter how successful you would be in the Finnish market, working from Procter & Gamble or Unilever or you name it, you still nobody. Because it's a smaller than a state. It'd be oh, you're big in Mississippi? Good. Exactly. I bet the market is booming.
So proud of you. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so that got me super excited about gaming, because I'm wow, we're making games here, but then the whole world plays them. So we are I think that was the biggest driver for me, is that sort of a opportunity.
I could totally see that. And it also became the dynamic in New York, if you open up a restaurant, right? The competition is so steep. It's a very sophisticated consuming constituency out there. If you open up a subpar restaurant in New York, you're going to be shut down. And I do feel like Finland now has that, the emperor has no clothes. If you're going to open up a studio, you better be legit, because people around you will call it out. Yeah. And there'll be a lot of, not sure, maybe, and I think the tourist capital that has gravitated towards our industry, I think several years back, they would see a slide and they would see, founders, and they worked at some of these, glorious Finnish companies, and, not necessarily triangulating on cross-referencing everyone's backgrounds and making sure who actually pushed product and touched product and who came on after the fact. And I think some companies that probably wouldn't have received funding did during the hype cycle. I think now that the world has kind of leveled off, that tourist capital has retreated to some degree. But it's such a competitive market, and it really is a market where the emperor has no clothes. There's just too many successful, smart people in gaming here.
Yeah. I think Joachim Akran, who also worked at Next Games, the co-founder, he wrote an interesting piece about the sort of I would say the maturity of the Finnish gaming market. I remember reading that kind of like that we've crossed the peak and we're kind of decline and are on a certain level. And he had certain reasons why he was talking about like. Do you think that the ecosystem here has peaked and now is in maturity, kind of looking for the next peak, or like what do you think is the current stage?
I mean, he's so close to the market, right? And I mean, I'm super close to a lot of the allocators here. You've got some great sources of capital here with Play and Sisu, and the guys are wonderful, and they've got discrete insights into the market. But I think sometimes if you're too close to something, it's tough to have an outsider's orientation to it. And no, I think I'm ever the optimist. I mean, I'm over here for my 55th time because I think there's so much ceiling left in this market. I think markets are cyclical. And I think, maybe we're having a maturation moment in the Finnish market. But I don't think it's a market that, we would be willing to spend less time in and pay attention to, because I do think some of the most innovative minds, some of the most successful entrepreneurs continue to propagate from this geography. And, I think the surrounding environments have done a lot as well.
Yeah. Talking to VCs who operate in this market and also VCs who have more global presence but have invested in Finland as well as in other regions. Like one of the things that has come up during the past years is sort of they have different words, but I would say kind of put it in together as like a lack of hunger of many of the studios. Like people have found a certain level of success and they're fine with it. And that's part of the Finnish culture. Not, of course, not with these super founders like the Ilkas of the world that just have no ceiling, just pushing into the.
Yeah.
But when it comes to majority and the culture of Finland is kind of it's not about boasting. It's very, as you said, stoic, but it's also not about flexing. And people don't push for that wealth as much as in maybe other cultures. And then when you kind of achieve a certain amount of it, you're like, why do more? And that was the sort of a sentiment that was given by some of the investors, because they are comparing these teams to, let's say, teams from Turkey that are working like it's their last day on earth every day. And so that's been a kind of like that sort of a comparison.
Yeah.
And of course, Finland has had already a good amount of success and Turkey has been coming up. And so as these investors have been comparing and especially looking at that sort of a drive, it seems like the capital has been going more towards like these more up and coming areas.
Look, I hear you. I'm not comfortable making that kind of a generalization. I'm just not. I think there are reasons why Turkey is now, spinning out as many successful startups, and we're in a few there, and we've been early there, and it's been incredible to watch. But
Spike,
and then you have the success of Dream, and there's a couple of others that we haven't yet announced that I'm not going to announce here.
Good stuff.
But again, when you saw the success of Graham and you saw the success of Peak, and these companies sold to Zynga, and you had folks that were locked into agreements with the company, and so they had to stay for a determined amount of time, and then they left and they spun out their own studio. So I think these emerging markets have their moments, and so much of it, if you forensically parse through why, more often than not, it's around M&A. And so there was a portfolio of companies that got gobbled up. And then those folks stayed for a period of time, and then they spun out and started their own thing. And I mean, if you just look at markets like the U.S., let's look at the West Coast. Look at Los Angeles. Like Los Angeles has become a hub of gaming that it was not a decade ago. It really was. If you looked at gaming in the U.S., it was Seattle. We had Microsoft, you had Valve, you had Nintendo at the time, and San Francisco was huge. Yes. It had its moment. No longer.
No, definitely not.
Definitely not. I need a big guy like you as an escort running around San Francisco.
Well, I left, so they even got scary to me too.
Yeah, it's a shame. That's another conversation because I do think it's going to be on its way back. But there is something too, if you look at the amount of unbelievable teams that have spun out of Blizzard and Activision and Riot. And that's why Los Angeles has now become this hub of, dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of startups in and around platform and infrastructure and content, whether it's developers or publishers or picks and shovels businesses, or even adjacent companies to gaming. Los Angeles has definitely become, and I'd say Los Angeles and the greater LA footprint, if you look at Irvine, even proximate to San Diego with, Sony down there, and even some of the chipset manufacturers, right? You've got Qualcomm proximate as well. So I think a lot of it has to do with that. M&A, teams maturing out of the acquiring platform and starting up their own businesses.
Yeah. I would add to that, maybe kind of like looking at this ecosystem as well as with the market. It's as you said, Helsinki especially is a very small town. Like we were talking about 500,000 people. Greater Helsinki might be 1 million, but we're really talking about 500,000 people. So that's not a lot. Yeah. And then when you have the effect of the big studios like Supercell, we got Netflix over here nowadays, your former company, Next Games became a Netflix. We got the EAs, we got the Ubisoft. So we have a few big studios that are hiring people and paying very good salaries, that American rate that pulls a lot of key talent inside them. And then at the same time, you have the maturity of the mobile gaming industry that kind of presents two things. Like capital is retracting, so not everybody's getting funded because they have a small team and they could do mobile game. And at the same time, they're probably detracting also from these teams because you need a bigger team in order to find a success in the mature market. And then at the same time, like when you need a bigger team, but then most of the people work at the incumbents, it's kind of hard to build that big, powerful team. And then through that, it's harder to get that capital. So I feel like there's multiple different elements playing together that are maybe slowing down the startup part, but benefiting the incumbents in Finland because it has matured to a place where Supercell is hiring like 10 people every week.
Right. Well, it's a very valid dynamic. You know, it's, again, I think it will ebb and flow, though. Yeah. It's inevitable that people are going to leave these large, even if you're paid a lot, they're going to have that entrepreneurial spirit, and they're going to recognize, well, wait a minute, there's still wood to chop out there. I can still go out on my own and make something. And the good thing in a market like Finland is you will have, if you're a Peter Pan, if you will, Pied Piper, and you can get people to follow you, there's the talent. The talent is here, and it's affordable.
Yeah, very.
And I think that's just a huge X factor that you don't see in the larger, more mature market. So again, I do think it ebbs and flows. You're absolutely right. You see these bigs coming in, but the fact that we're referencing Netflix as an incumbent, right, is phenomenal. Yeah. Because they were so not an incumbent, 2-3 years ago, and that's the other thing that you're seeing globally are all these non-endemics. I call them new actors that have entered the theater, that have recognized that interactive storytelling is where the most elusive and the most attractive demographics in the global media landscape are. And how do we capture them? And by the way, that includes carriers. If I'm a carrier in any market, I'm giving up, 60 to 65% of all my revenue is spent on gaming. And I don't touch any of that. Yeah. I don't have any relationship with that consumer. And that's wild. And so I do think you're going to start to see some of the bigger telcos and some of the bigger geographies start to embrace, hey, how do we from the ground up create a relationship with this demographic, with this particular consuming constituency?
Like what this could look like carriers not entering gaming for the first time, because it used to be part of that whole feature phone.
Oh God, yeah.
So this is like the loop
like
is
where
closing.
You were stacked on the tech. Remember that?
So exactly. Like what do you mean by carriers sort of finding new interest towards games? Like how do you see this happening or in practice?
I think the same way you're seeing folks like Netflix invest in the ecosystem, I think you could easily see, in particular in emerging markets where consumption patterns are different than they are in the West. Some of the bigger telcos in Middle East, North Africa, Africa proper, Indian subcontinent. I think you could see them ingesting capital directly into some of these games businesses and creating exclusive content that would be featured on their hardware. They could be bundled onto the hardware. They could. I'm not saying they should circumnavigate the existing marketplaces. iOS and Android, but it's nuts that they don't have a voice. Yeah. I mean, they've kind of self-commoditized themselves into being a big, fat, dumb pipe. It's like the more successful they get, the more removed they are from the end user. And I think that's going to change because there's some very smart folks at these carriers, and they're going to want to figure out how to have a seat at the table. And same thing with legacy media. Yeah. When you see Disney put $1.5 billion into Epic, and they were already in that deal, right? I think that was one of the original deals through their incubator 1 million years ago. But they did recognize, hey, this is where a very core demographic, to our Disney brand is living and breathing. We've got to get smarter about this. We can't continue to just license out our intellectual property to third parties. And yes, they can make good money doing that, but they're leaving literally billions on the table. And I think as importantly, they're also leaving that relationship with the customer, with the fan.
This podcast is brought to you by AppsFlyer. In today's digital world, understanding your app's journey from discovery to download is more than just insightful, it's essential. Enter AppsFlyer, the leader in mobile attribution and marketing analytics that allows you to measure the full potential of your marketing efforts, making every ad dollar work smarter. With AppsFlyer, that's your new reality. Dive deep into data-driven insights that reveal exactly where your users come from and how they'll interact with your app. AppsFlyer, where your app's potential meets performance.
Step into the future of game monetization with Xsolla, the premier partner for game developers seeking to expand their reach and revenue. Xsolla provides a robust suite of tools designed to enhance user acquisition, manage subscriptions, and streamline payment solutions worldwide. Unlock new markets and maximize profitability through their customized, secure payment architecture and dedicated support team. Xsolla, powering game developers to achieve global success.
Yeah, Disney is a whole different story. They seem to invest and divest, then licensing, then they invest again, then they again divest, and they again go to a licensing model. But kind of like...
Yeah, but I'm super bullish on them.
Yeah, well, yes.
The brands that they own and control.
Yeah, well, the biggest ones.
It's amazing.
So I wanted to kind of like, now we're going to one of the main topics that I want to talk about is transmedia. So that has been, of course, a huge trend with the success of the movies last year. We're talking about Mario or see, I'm blanking.
Gran Turismo, Five Nights at Freddy's, 3 of the top 10 grossing films.
Exactly.
Based
so
on games.
Yeah, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle came out. You've been doing transmedia, you've been doing transmedia before it was known as transmedia.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I have sat right at that apex, the nexus, if you will, of gaming, media, and sport my entire career. I was the I know we skipped the background part, but I was the CEO, co-founder of Nerdist Industries, for God's sakes. And in my early days, the first company I ever invested in, which I mentioned to you earlier, back in '98, first check I ever wrote was into a company called GameSpy Industries. And, it was definitely part and parcel of that, the Warren Buffett thesis of invest in what you know and what you use. And, I was a rabid GameSpy consumer because if you wanted to play, Quake or Doom or Half-Life or Duke Nukem against anyone else in the world, you needed that software crawler to help propagate that experience unless you were playing at a LAN party.
Was that Dennis Fong's company?
That was not. This was Mark Surface's company.
Oh, got it.
Dennis Fong was Thresh, right?
Yeah.
He was like the professional Quake.
Yes.
Yeah, that was Dennis. Dennis was the man. Dennis was like the first guy. He's still legendary.
Yes. Anyway, sorry for that.
Okay. I'm a fanboy and he's a friend.
Yes.
I'm a fanboy. And, back then when I invested in GameSpy, I remember, everyone was kind of looking at me sideways, in particular in LA, like, never heard of this thing. You closet gamers, this was back when the tropes were, you're in your mother's basement playing World of Warcraft and the whatnot. But the truth of the matter is, if you just look at, as you mentioned, 3 of the top 10 films last year, and the last 3 years running now, this year, the #1 streaming show will more than likely be Fallout on Amazon, which I was proud to play a big role in helping to architect it getting there, sharing my role at Lionsgate. The year before, you had The Last of Us on HBO Max, which was amazing based on the game. And then the year before that, it was The Witcher on Netflix.
Sad ending.
Sad ending. Originally was the graphic novel, then became the game, and it was really the game that helped propel the IP to to Netflix wanting it to become what it became. And so we're seeing more and more of that. And when you look at our industry, and it's larger than film, music, and publishing combined, that's something that the global media landscape and ecosystem is going to take note of. And as parts of their business, the legacy businesses continue to shrink, and the streaming platforms continue to dominate, they're going to have to figure out how do they play more directly with these demographics. And when you look at the success of titles like Marvel Snap, we talked about Disney and Marvel, right? And Second Dinner, I'm now shilling for one of them.
Of course.
But those guys are amazing.
Yes.
I mean, these are the OG Hearthstone guys. Like, no one's better at a TCG than these guys, a CCG. And as someone who owns close to 500,000 trading cards, I can relate to this. The fact that they have executed so well with that intellectual property, and you can go up and down the charts and look at these games that are based on third-party IP. And then if you look at 10 years ago and beyond, there were very few. And I think that the model used to be, and I think Disney was guilty of this, hey, who's going to write us the biggest minimum guarantee check? We're going to grind you in the negotiation as the IP rights holder because we don't really understand gaming. So we're just going to really put this thing out to auction. Whoever's going to write us the biggest check, we're going to grind you, which means your development cycle is going to collapse. So we're actually handicapping the game from go. And we're not really going to support you much because we're not at all angling for the back end because we're probably not going to see it because we've already done damage to you. So it's like a self-inflicted wound.
Yeah.
And I think what happened was you started then to have people on the legacy media side grow up in the industry that grew up playing games. And so they weren't treating gaming the same way as they were treating a license to, oh, you're going to make the lunchbox, right? And you're going to make the Halloween costume. And, oh, my next licensing deal is with this gaming company. No, they started to look at it like, hey, how can we put a relationship together where our interests are much more mutually aligned? And this is what we do, a lot of this. And I've done, a ton of this, right? I helped, as I mentioned, Fallout get to Amazon, which was super fun to help architect that at the beginning, and Candy Crush to CBS, which is an unwatchable game show. Please don't watch it. It's a longer story. It's unwatchable.
But it's there.
It is there, and I did help get Borderlands to Lionsgate, which
let's not talk about that either.
Let's not talk about that either. I was way gone when they decided to do with it what they did, but I was instrumental in getting it there. But the point is, you're going to see more and more of these intellectual properties get adapted well. I mean, brilliantly. I mean, I thought Fallout was so fun to watch as someone who's obsessed with the intellectual property, obsessed with what Todd Howard was able to do with that property as the steward of that lore, of that canon. And The Last of Us was, amazing. You're going to see more. I mean, Super Mario was so fun to watch. The reason being, it's the folks that are now, whether they're directors or they're the writers or the producer or the showrunner, they grew up playing games. And before, so much of these films and these television series and these streaming shows that would be developed and produced were based on, articles in the New Yorker or, the LA Times or the Wall Street Journal, or they would be, the origin source was a book. And the folks who would make some of the films that were based on video games really didn't grow up playing them. And so they were suboptimal, like Warcraft. I mean, but for, China as a market, Warcraft was a disaster as a movie. But the Chinese loved it. Thank God for Legendary who made the movie and bought my company Nerdist.
Yes.
But that's changed. And now when I was on that first call where Jonah Nolan, the showrunner for Fallout, was on the phone with Todd Howard, and you could hear him talking to Todd about his passion and affinity for that game. And I mean, this guy knew, every little nuance, every little detail, loved the soundtrack, understood even the color palette, right? And he was all about it, and that unique vault culture. And you could tell this guy had spent thousands of hours playing the game, and you're going to see more and more of that.
Oh, okay. So this is really interesting because this is what I was trying to understand. It's like the history of transmedia with games is just so spotty. Like you have, as you said, Fallout followed by Borderlands. You got, Last of Us, you got World of Warcraft. So it's kind of like either a hit or an absolute disaster. And it's interesting that you're pointing out it's just like one of the key reasons why something becomes a hit is because of the people working on the adaptation are true fans and really understand the intellectual property of that game and have been inside that culture for decades before venturing out. Is that one of the key elements why the success occurs, or what other elements there are in transmedia that have to be taken into account?
I think it definitely is. I think it makes all the difference in the world. But you're still going to have flops, as you do in any form of media, right? There's no way to avoid that. But it's a huge driver. I think the other dynamic and the power shift that has occurred, it used to be this hub spoke model where you had at the hub was a piece of intellectual property, and you had the stewards of that IP look at film or television as primary drivers and everything else as cursory and ancillary, almost a hobby. And now it's completely inverted. Because if you look at the sales of Hogwarts Legacy, right, that game did $800 million in that first week.
Huge.
Yeah. And for someone, huge fan of the IP, right? We've all read the books. You'll read them to your kids.
Well, kind of read it.
Well, I read them to my my son was of that age.
They're too young. They're too young.
Yeah. Well, they'll get there. But I remember, that was the thing at the time, reading them and falling asleep, and then I would fall asleep reading them too. But we all wanted to explore Hogwarts, and we finally had the opportunity to do so in Hogwarts Legacy. And the fact that that game was able to do 800 million in a week, David Haddad, who runs that division of Warner Discovery, it's incredible what that guy's been able to do. And it's happened because his benefactors recognize, and it really started with Kevin Tsujihara back in the day, hey, gaming is bigger than and will continue to grow at a clip that no other part of our business will. How can we create a friendly zone, if you will, safe harbor for our executives, our team to propagate these types of experiences without just being an extension of the marketing of a film or a television series. And until that happens, I think legacy media is going to continue to stumble.
Yeah.
But what you can't ignore are these numbers. And when you look at, the sales for Fallout after the success of the series, and the sales of the soundtrack to Fallout, after the success of the series. And so you have people like myself who played the game for decades who are now rediscovering it and having fun with it again. You have people who never played the game, who found the series, like, I want to explore this. So you're going to see a lot of this crossover, going back and forth. And it's fun to watch because it can drive tens of millions of eyeballs going in either direction. But going back to Disney for a moment, and I think this is one of the things that, they're having their aha moment. For example, if you're going to release a film or a series on Disney Plus, or even a theme park attraction, if you can tie that into what you're doing in your interactive storytelling, and you can make that cohort aware that these things are coming out versus having to reacquire them, and every time you want a message to them, you have to invest in that messaging, versus if you owned and control that relationship with that end user, you could do a heck of a lot more with them and for them. And I think that's the other thing. This mutually aligned interests, I think is super important. And you're going to continue to see these legacy media businesses want to have more skin in that game. They're just leaving billions on the table.
Super interesting points. Thinking about where to dive in. So let me dive to this one. So you mentioned something about conviction with the legacy medias, if you will. David Haddad and Warner Brothers, they've been in games for a long time. That's one of the long standing where you can really see their, for over a decade,
way over a decade.
DC, Mortal Kombat, you name it. They have
Lego, Arkham.
Exactly. So they've really built that conviction, and it is a legit division, a business unit standing inside the organization. But what I've
shining star.
Yeah, exactly. But what I've seen happening with some other large entities in the same business is that they kind of want to have that in about 2 years. And they build up quickly the organization, they hire the people, but as they're forming and storming, they basically close everything down. So what's your sort of advice for the big IP holders? How should they build the organization so that they can have long-lasting success that goes over the flops and the successes and kind of produces value over a longer time?
I think first and foremost, if you look at the legacy media businesses that are in multiple form factors, film, television, music, publishing, location-based entertainment, if you just look at the quality of the executives that are running those businesses for them respectively, I think you have to, at the helm, have executives that match that gravitas in gaming, right? And traditionally, they've assigned someone from, corporate development or a licensing and merchandise person or someone who's maybe adjacent to gaming, but hasn't really built their career up to the point where their CV would, line up with some of these others in film or television or music or publishing. And I think that's the investment of time, but also resources. And I think David Haddad is a great example of what Kevin Tsujihara and the rest of the hierarchy at the time at Warner Brothers allowed for this business to flourish. But you're right. It took a runway. It took a long time. They allowed acquisition, like really contemplative, smart, strategic global
Turbine
acquisition.
And some other ones. Yeah.
A bunch, including Playdemic, which they ended up selling off, to EA for $1.4 billion. So it's a good result. Golf Clash. I was very addicted to that game. That game is super addictive.
Fourth Star, your portfolio company.
Yeah, here we go again.
Paul Goosh.
But again, come on.
He's one of the best.
He's amazing. The guy's like one of one. But again, I think you're going to see more and more of that. And I don't think it's just going to be, the 7 or 6 or 8 film studios, depending on who's buying what. But you're going to see, like I mentioned, I think you're going to start to see, the telcos getting active and the carriers. And you're going to start to see a lot of the adjacent businesses, try to figure out how can we collaborate and cooperate together. You're going to see, and you're seeing it. You're seeing the sports leagues around the globe, whether it's Bundesliga or Serie A or Premier League or the NFL or the NBA. They're all starting to invest into these businesses. They want to be a part of the conversation. They don't want to just be in this dynamic, again, where they're just licensing their IP out, banking a minimum guarantee, not seeing anything on the back end, but I think more importantly, just giving up that relationship.
Do you think you can, of course you can, but do you think there's visible some overinvestments from these platforms, like where they invest too much earlier for their appetite and then they start kind of getting antsy because of that? Should there be some sort of a ramp up to the investments, or should you just go all in like Netflix style, like billions invested right away?
Look,
as a venture capitalist, you say billions. Of course, we have plenty of studios for you to acquire that can build up great business. But
if I answered that way, that would be a little too self-serving.
No,
gajillions. I would like you all.
There's no cap.
Yeah, and I'll deploy it for you if you feel the need. I got you. No, I do think it's more case by case. Mm-hmm. I do think you're going to see. It's inevitable that you're going to see media businesses at scale buy at scale. And they're going to fill in and around it. And I think, some of the smartest executives in media are at Netflix, right? They are.
Yes.
These people are sharp as a tack, and, they can take some shots on goal and they can A/B test because they know that they have to. Google and Stadia, that didn't work out the way, they would have liked. But if you think that's their last shot on goal, like, you're kidding yourself, right? They have to be there.
Yeah.
So I think you're going to continue to see at different scale folks investing in, and I think you're going to start to see, M&A. It's going to be fun. But it is going to be, it is definitely inevitable. And I think if you're on the other side of that conversation, I think there was skepticism. I don't want to say cynicism, but certainly skepticism on either side. Like, are we ever going to be able to really play well together? And I think those days are long gone.
Yeah. Yeah, both are working in entertainment products and both are entertaining millions of people. And I think there's plenty to learn from gaming to other sorts of media, and then the other way around. And then we have great success cases with M&A, like New York Times, now one of the biggest game companies in terms of word games and the other ones.
It's insane. Like their portfolio, it's incredible what they've been able to do quietly.
Yeah,
right.
Through very focused acquisitions.
Yeah,
growing their business, not maybe building everything in house, but building both in house and acquiring key assets and growing them. Like, I find that type of approach, maybe it's because of my Finnish background, that is more appealing because it's like measured rather than like all in cowboy style. Let's just buy 5 studios at the same time.
Well, I feel you on that. I do think that's a super contemplative blocking and tackling way to go about it, and it's worked out for them. But they're also self-aware, right? They know who their demo is. It's a very sophisticated audience, right? They're going to respond to that type of a game mechanic, and anything more aggressive than that would be a non-starter for them.
Exactly.
And so those things are also somewhat capped, and they're self-contained. And I think there's a self-awareness to that kind of M&A. But I do think some of the bigger swings will come from companies that in decades past, they've made mistakes, and they're going to learn from those mistakes. These are some really sharp people that are running these businesses all around the globe.
Yeah.
And I think COVID, in addition to just the pure numbers, right, and the economics, but the engagement metrics, but there was a psychological hurdle that transpired during COVID, which was you had a ton of people that typically had jobs where they were out of the house in the morning, they dropped their kids off, or they didn't even, get to see that, and they were on a train, they were going to the city, they'd come back at night. They had no idea that their kids were no longer watching, traditional media form factors. No. They really didn't. And they they're locked under the same roof with these kids, and they're realizing they're either gaming or they're watching other people play games.
Yeah, YouTube Kids,
Twitch. But that was a huge aha moment for a lot of folks, and in particular, that happened in finance. Right? You just saw even how it impacted quarterly reports afterwards. Like they're not directly, quoting anecdotes from their home, but you could tell that just the tone and the tenor was not so much, this gaming thing that is far afield from me. It was a much more intimate conversation around this gaming thing that was taking over the world. But certainly in media as well. You had a lot of folks realizing, hey, Sally and Johnny are not consuming things the way we think about when we're sitting in these rooms and we're talking about it. And you can't dictate consumption patterns. Like there's a lot of hubris in that. You have to react to it and respond to it and find your way into that conversation.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because when we're making predictions in 2023 for 24, anyways, a couple of years ago, and I thought that there will be much more investments coming from streaming platforms, kind of following what Netflix was doing, and that didn't happen. Only Netflix was the one to go forward to bring their IPs into other form of entertainment. So that was what do you think that happened? Why is only Netflix doing that and everybody else is kind of waiting in the shadows?
Because I think this good observation. I actually thought the same thing at the time. So it's okay to be a little bit early in our thinking and not necessarily on point with regard to execution. And you don't always have to be the first through the wall. I think a lot of these streaming platforms are still trying to figure out who they are, what they're going to be. They're struggling, some of them, to figure that out. I think it's because Netflix is doing such a good job. Like just when you count them out, they're just... their algorithm is so much better than everyone else's. It just is.
Yeah.
And so I still think that that competitive cohort is trying to figure out who they are, how are they going to execute. Any of them that are going to be left standing are going to get into gaming.
Yeah.
Because they do not want to drive people off their platform, right, to go game elsewhere. I mean, that would be insanity. And I think that's why back in the day, you remember with Xbox Live, you'd have all those other apps. You could watch Netflix on your Xbox Live.
I remember that.
Well, I think there was their aha moment. Like, well, we're either going to make people get off our platform and turn this thing off and go consume media elsewhere. Well, the reacquisition cost of that customer is material and even prohibitive for some folks. So it's like, we got to figure out a way to make this make sense.
That's I didn't think about it that way. Yeah. Yeah, and plus now that the streamer platforms that will be left standing will kind of be able to learn what worked for Netflix, what didn't, because they're getting some expensive lessons as we're seeing them build this business as a first streamer in that sense. But again, they're making a ton of money, so what's expensive for everybody else is not that expensive for them.
No, but I still think, to your point about the New York Times, that these folks should, and they will, they should acquire things or invest in things that will speak to, who that discrete audience is. And it is a different audience for all of them. And I think that's going to be a lot of fun to see how that plays out. And I think, to your point as well, I think a lot of the legacy media businesses will look at, well, what did Warner do well, right? It's more nuanced than just, Jeff Bewkes and Kevin Tsujihara gave David Haddad, a lot of money and said, go execute. He executed. And what did he do well? And there were some stumbles along the way. And how do we not replicate that? So I think, again, there's enough history now for folks to forensically parse through it and look at that and say, okay, what can we do, to make sure we don't make some of those mistakes? And what can we do to make sure our brands and these brand equities are treated, the right way. And then on the flip side of that, you also have folks who traditionally in a million years would never subject their intellectual property as a game to, what could be a self-inflicted wound as a poorly executed film or television series. So you now have people on the gaming side saying, well, wait a minute, there's some really compelling adaptations of this IP that is helping to drive the sales of our game and the awareness of our game and extend the long tail of our game. A lot of stickiness and community around our game in ways that we couldn't contemplate. Let's have those conversations now. And I think that's a lot of fun.
That brings in an interesting conversation that we always kind of end up debating about on our weekly show, and that is the business case for Transmedia. And you mentioned a couple of things like, milking from minimal guarantees. So that's the upfront cost before you can start the development. It can go up to 20 million for some of the biggest IPs out there. Then the revenue share, which is very difficult for companies because you have to take that into account in your user acquisition. Like, that can be quite significant. And then there's the approval process that can be difficult with different brands because when you have to react, especially when you have to do different type of marketings, that limits you in a certain way and it slows down your development. So there are a lot of, I want to say like a hindrance when working with an IP, and there's a lot of benefits. So how do you approach building a good business case? Like when to work with an IP and when to understand that you shouldn't actually, that now it's like too hot, like Game of Thrones in I don't know, 2015,
right?
Like too hot, let's not touch it.
I think it's such a great point, right? And I think if it doesn't feel right chemically, you shouldn't do it, right? You should not just chase the big IP to chase the big IP, because if you're not going to have a partner on the other side of that conversation that wants to be a partner and not just a licensor, it's not going to work. Right? They have to buy into this partnership, this relationship. I remember, if I could tell a war story.
That's what we're here for.
Sometimes some people overdo the war stories, but this is, I think it's relevant to this. When I was running, I stood up the games business for Lionsgate. After I sold Nerdist to Legendary, I took a year and, screwed around a little bit. And my wife was like, get out of the house, figure out something. And I was offered the really fun role of doing something super entrepreneurial within a corporate environment, which was Lionsgate. And my very good friend, John Feldheimer, as the CEO, brought me on board to stand up this interactive business. And one of the products that we helped introduce to the market was a commercial introduction of John Wick into Fortnite, which at the time was just a huge, huge thing in the gaming zeitgeist.
Yeah.
I remember the numbers on Reddit were gobsmacking how many people were talking about this. But Donald Mustard, who was, the heart and soul, the brain, the steward again of the Fortnite brand, he flew out and brought members of his team to meet with us at Lionsgate. And, I remember him saying, and I'm going to edit this a little bit. Yeah. It's a revisionist history, but something to the effect of, okay, we've done some of these things with media companies. And I'd known Donald and the team a bit. He said, but we're kind of used to this drill. So here's the 15 things we'd love to do. Tell us the one or two you're going to let us do. And our body language back and mine was, I knew what I had. Like, I knew I needed Fortnite more than they needed John Wick. And it was, no, you can do all 15 of those things. And maybe these other 17 could be of interest to you. But not only that, we brought the director of the movie in to meet with the guys, and Keanu met with the guys, and we took them out to the shooting range where Keanu did his training.
Tactical
shooting. And it was so collaborative, but the results were, again, just gobsmacking, right? So I think it was something like the week before John Wick 3 came out, and this was a commercial deal. So, they paid for these rights, and, there was a lot went into this. Something like 400 million hours of gameplay with John Wick in the week before that film. So that's I don't know what that number translates to. I mean, we've done the math, but I'm not going to throw that out there on this. But it's an astronomical figure for a subscale studio to get that kind of attention in the week leading up to the release of a film. And this is where Donald was brilliant. What he did was, instead of announce it, instead of marketing it, he just put John Wick's house on a hillside in the game, right? He just dropped the house in there, and then as a Fortnite player, you could go in the house, you go down the stairs, and you remember where he took the sledgehammer and he broke up the cement, and that's where the weapons were. And there was a sledgehammer against the wall, and the cement was broken, and just people's heads were exploding. And then a few days later, they dropped John Wick and a couple of the characters into the game. But like watching that and understanding, like in a healthy partnership between a gaming intellectual property, a brand equity, and that was at their zenith. That was like right after they had done the Avengers activation, where again, I think they ran into a bunch of friction from Disney. So they had some PTSD coming to us because they're like, we're not going to do the overly commercial stuff that Disney wants to do. We're like, no, whatever you want to do, we know our place here. And it was so much fun to see. And I use that example a lot when I'm talking to our portfolio companies because we do a ton of this work on behalf of our portcos. You know, and some of it is at smaller scale. Skills it's a skill-based real money wagering company, went public. It was a very nice return for our investors in a collapsed window. But the three of the biggest pieces of IP on their platform were Big Buck Hunter, Golden Tee, and Tetris. And we were instrumental in bringing those across the finish line. I mean, Big Buck Hunter, George Petro, who runs the company that makes that you know the game, the arcade game?
I think I've played the arcade version.
That's the one.
With
It's in like 50,000 arcades around the world.
It was downstairs at Zynga's offices. So
okay. So the guy who runs that company, the deal was sitting on his desk, and I don't think he had any intention of signing it. Yeah. He's like, what is this skills thing? And I've known the guy for 25 years. I'd done a bunch of stuff with him in the past, and I called him. I say, do this. This will be a huge piece of business for you. It's the right thing to do. And it was a win-win for everyone. And that's when I think, as someone who, you're not just connecting parties, but you're interpreting. And some of the things that either side can get anxious about, they're not worth worrying about, but they need someone to explain to them why. And I think that you're seeing more and more people that can now serve in that role. I just happen to be doing it like my entire career. And a lot of this stuff, you know, used to get laughed at, right? Like when you're the CEO, co-founder of a company called Nerdist, you know, get a lot of head scratching at, you know, dinners with, you know, other folks. And, and now we're here. And, you know, gaming is a kind of apex predator.
Yeah. Well, it's a better name than Deconstructor of Fun. But
I don't agree with that. Deconstructor Fun's a lot of fun in that name. Let's deconstruct it.
Yeah. What John Wick was that? 3 or 4?
It was leading up to 3.
It was leading up to 3. Okay, got it. Yeah, I mean, it's a violent show.
But if ever a film screamed gaming, it was that.
Yes, of course, and shooting.
And killing. And killing. It also worked because you had a guy like Donald Mustard who loved John Wick. Loved it.
Yeah.
And so when you got you got him to get together with the director of the film and even Keanu, like, they felt it. And there was no... You know, there was no sentiment of, oh, these guys are going to get the better of me, or, oh, we're going to get one over on them. It was like, how can we make this as rad as humanly possible?
And that Easter egg approach of like having the house, but not
super cool. But that was all him.
Yeah, just telling that you really understand the brand, you really understand the IP, you're doing something right because you'd enjoy this. So understand that partnership angle.
And that's why, again, if you watch Fallout, when you see what Jonah Nolan has done with that show, you know he's played the game. There are so many little wink nods to the fan base.
What about in some of the, like when we're having debates about transmedia, there's a lot of things where the other party approaches from connection to the audience, brand building, long-term view, and then the other part approaching more from bean counting aspect, like what's the uplift, how much we're spending, how much, you know, like all the costs and whether this makes sense. How do you kind of find a balance between those two?
Yeah, I think in years past, these types of partnerships and relationships and conversations suffered from too much of paralysis from analysis. You have to have aligned vision, right? And I think you have to have that aligned passion, right? We get this. We're going to go on this journey together. We're going to hit some bumps in the road, but the end of this journey is going to be a huge net positive financially, but also in terms of the value for this brand equity. Plus, I do think you have to be careful. If you own and control an intellectual property as a game that's been successful for decades, is it really worth, you know, adapting into another media form factor? Like, you have to run that calculus. If this thing doesn't work, is it going to be okay? You know, will, you know, the core audience, will they forgive us for this? Like, will they celebrate that we tried if we try to do it the right way? And I think that's why it can't come down to minimum guarantees, you know, squeezing each other. It's got to come down to, let's put a real partnership in place. If that sentiment isn't genuine on either side, I think you're going to come up short.
And I think the other part is just the long-term view, not only with that single cooperation or partnership, but like when we look at Scopely, like starting off with Yahtzee, then moving on to, was it Wheel of Fortune, and then moving on to Monopoly Go. All of these are Hasbro IPs or Hasbro games.
Yeah.
And it's not like we're going to do Monopoly Go right away, but it's a decade plus of working together with that partner where you get that leeway where development of Monopoly Go, how many years it took? Like they scrapped it, they started from the beginning, but the partner trusts them. We know what you're doing. You take some time, but in the end, the results are going to be there.
It's a great example, too, of, I believe, Monopoly Go was the first wholly internally developed game at Scopely, because so much of their development was done by acquisition.
Yes, true.
Or third-party devs. And you had Aaron Loeb, who's an operating partner of ours, who's just an incredible piece of talent out there. But that's exactly right. What Hasbro, having that patience and a long view, like, hey, it's okay. Mm-hmm. We can put up some singles and some doubles. I'm sorry for you non-baseball fans. That's my
I thought that was basketball.
Okay. Touchdown. Being able to put up singles and doubles and knowing that our interests are aligned and we're going to keep taking shots on goal together and try to win, I think that's the right attitude. If it's purely transactional, it rarely is going to work, right? You've got to have buy-in from both sides because it's a long journey. And inevitably there are going to be pivots, and you want to make sure that someone can be nimble with you. There will be some friction along the way, but it should be coming from a good place.
So perhaps if you want to work with Disney and this is your first thing, maybe don't license Marvel right away. Maybe start off with like putting Mickey in one of the events and like whatever it is, like individual characters.
By the way, the fact that you're like saying because Mickey's small and Marvel's big is kind of nutty.
I've sat with Disney maybe in some meetings, so I know some pricing that they have for their characters. So
we could even go more linearly. Like look at, because a bunch of my team are obsessed with Magic, like including my co-founding partner.
Gathering.
Oh yeah, MTG. Like they're going to MagicCon in October in Vegas.
I did that when I was 12. I understand that.
Okay, well, so again, I'm a huge card collector, so I like to collect the Secret Lair cards because they do these unbelievable collabs with third-party intellectual property, and some of them they did Lord of the Rings. They have a Ghostbusters one that's coming out. They did a Fallout collab, which was amazing. They did a Warhammer collab, and I think the Warhammer collab was so successful that the folks at Games Workshop who own Warhammer, I think they actually started to scale it back because they're like, whoa, this could actually be cannibalizing our core product. Damn. And this is a transmedia extension of an intellectual property, right? This is part of what that cornucopia of opportunity could be. And I think that's where it gets really fun. It's no longer about, does it have to be a film or television series? It could absolutely be podcast. It could go into publishing. It could go toyetically. There could be licensing and merchandise opportunities. I think the conversation is almost limitless if you have that vision and that passion and alignment.
Yeah. Franchise management.
Franchise management, but that's a little too antiseptic, right? Because that to me, that harkens back to that old hub and spoke model of like, well, we have our hub as the TV show, and then we're going to extend it into these other areas. Like, I don't think you should go into any of those conversations thinking, you know what, this thing is it's going to be siloed and it's going to be capped. Like, I don't know, this thing could end up being bigger than the kernel, right? The genesis of this intellectual property. So I don't think you have to tether yourself to tropes of yesteryear.
Yeah, very interesting. It kind of brings back times like, decade or so at Supercell that was saying no to everything. And that was kind of their secret power of just the focus on the game and not doing any of these very lucrative deals, what could have grown the franchise. But they have changed since then. They started the esports, that kind of one. There's the animations, then the toy line that, I was back in 2013. I was meeting with Stryker Entertainment. I know they're partners of yours and other ones at the toy shows in Vegas, kind of figuring out what that.
By the way, Stryker was Russell. I called Russell Binder, who runs Stryker, and I called him from Finland. Yeah. And I said, I think I'm going to hand you the biggest piece of business that you've never heard of, and that was Angry Birds.
Yes, I know.
And that guy knocked it out of the
Yes.
park. He put like $1 billion program together within a year.
He was helping with Supercell originally
I know.
in 2013, kind of like figuring out, and that was at their offices in LA and so forth,
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
like creating. And Supercell was very focused back then because it was able to say, hey, let's park this. Let's not do this now. We want to focus on what's the main thing. And now they're kind of, taken out of the park and
But I think that's right. And that's
Yeah.
what I mean about be self-aware. Like if it doesn't feel right at the moment, don't do it.
Yeah.
Right? There's no reason to. But
there's no rush.
There's no rush. And I think in some instances there never will be. But if you're the Walt Disney Company, and if you look at their portfolio of intellectual property of Star Wars, Marvel, Pixar, Disney proper, Fox, even the Muppets, right? Like you have to play in this arena with some of that intellectual property. There's no way around it. And so I do think you're going to see them get more and more active and aggressive because they don't want to give that relationship away to a third party going forward. It's just too much revenue, but it's also the intimacy of that relationship is too valuable.
Yeah. So interesting. Kind of like there's no one rule fits all. Like there's all these opportunities, but you have to be conscious of what you're doing. You have to find the right partners. You have to find your own speed and play the long-term game.
Indeed.
Very high-level words, but it's hard in real life, easy to kind of summarize it, but very
A little word salady there at the
Yeah.
end, but I do think there's now enough examples of it working.
Yeah.
And I think even in smaller circumstances and instances, like I pointed out, skills, and we've done a ton of this work with our portcos, and it also it helps collapse business development and corporate development cycles when there is that institutional knowledge. But it's also knowing when to walk away.
Yeah.
To your question earlier, like, this doesn't feel right now.
Yeah.
We can revisit this at a later time.
Very interesting. Just
Man,
like management books. Like they're very clear, but in real life, it's very hard to lead people.
It is, but I think it's getting, I think it's laden with less friction now than ever because there are successes and there's passion on both sides. It's like every athlete wants to be an actor, right? It's true. Like,
Do they?
Of course. And every actor wants to be an athlete. Like there's so much, admiration amongst, parties. I think that also exists in gaming and traditional media form factors. Like a lot of these guys and gals that have vision and passion, and they've been making these games, these iconic franchises. I definitely think that there are some of them that look at say, I could do this.
Yeah,
I could contribute to.
Or I could be at Cannes Film Festival. Like, how come
Right?
not there? How come?
Damn it.
Yeah. Sounds like a lot of fun. I want to be on the right carpet as well.
Let's fix that.
Somebody fly me from Monaco from here.
Bingo.
Yes, there's a lot of lures with the broader entertainment. To take it home, future of gaming. Like we talked a lot about Transmedia, and of course that's where your strength is. Not only that, but that's where you have the great connections and a lot of success. What about like other aspects in gaming, like Web3, real money gaming, sort of almost seems to be as a new rise of PC games, especially like AA, single A games, like indie publishing. What's exciting for you when looking at future gaming? Of course, as a venture capital, you're very future focused.
It's such a broad question. I think, first of all, so fun to take a deep dive into IP and transmedia. No, because this is probably the deepest dive I've ever taken with anyone into it.
Oh, awesome.
And I just flew in here last night, so apologize for the jet lag. My body's accustomed to it, I think. But, for us, it's not about being the first through the wall on anything. Mm-hmm. For example, we still haven't invested in a single VR or AR company. That's not to say we don't want to. We'd love to. We just need to see different type of signal out there. Esports teams, not venture friendly. We believe in competitive gaming. We believe in the growth of competitive gaming and esports. We just don't think a lot of what we see in some of this opportunity set as venture friendly. These are longer holds. What's incredibly exciting, emerging markets.
Middle East,
North Africa, Africa proper. Indian subcontinent, just super exciting.
Yeah, and population growth definitely,
and just consumption patterns and shift of wealth. It's really fun to keep. Even parts of Latin America. Spent a bunch of time in Brazil and Colombia and Mexico. I haven't been to Colombia yet, but I spent a lot of time looking at the market. Mexico, and there's other markets down there that are finally kind of lifting up the obstructions to external capital. It just made it was really tough to invest in some of these markets. It's becoming less so. So that, I mean, Brazil is an incredible market. So I do think that expanding geographies and markets that aren't close to maturing is something that we spend a lot of time looking at. And then, you know, the indie gaming is so fun, right? And we have some internal expertise, and you know, my personal proclivities probably skew more towards indie actually than mainstream over the years. And there's some really interesting business models that are gelling around that. You know, whether that's combining some forces and seeing what can be cobbled together. You know, we've always been believers in PC gaming, so to see a resurgence, if you will, of AA, gaming and consumption on PC is exciting. But also, and again, this gets talked about a ton, but it is worth mentioning, the female cohort, right? Eclipsing males eventually on mobile, and in particular in emerging markets. So, understanding what kinds of products will that next generation, what is that form factor? Where is that white space that's left out there to innovate? Where are the maturing products where you could come up with an interesting mechanic, and pivot and introduce yet another something into the market. So these are all areas of great interest to us.
That makes a lot of sense, looking at people or consumers, their consumption habits, and then making your decision through that, rather than looking at technologies and investing in technology that then may or may not create consumption habits or be a hit with consumers.
Yeah, I mean, I said it earlier, and I think it holds true. Look, we invest equally in platform infrastructure as we do in content. We always have. I have been investing for now more than 25 years, and if I parse through everything I've ever touched, from GameSpy to, Hightail to everything we've done with Griffin, it's still pretty much 50-50.
You do that good platform tools and tech report that comes every year, I think,
sure.
with the Japanese fund, the 3D engine-based. Shit, I forgot them.
Well, I'm the jet-lagged one, so
yeah, it's fine. I just wanted to
put
give
it in
them
the
a
notes.
shout out. I wanted to give them a shout out, but I forgot the name. But excellent report every year.
Appreciate that. It's it's something we take very seriously, but it's such a fun time to be doing what it is that we're doing in the industry within which that we're doing it. The fact that we can have these types of like we talked for an hour about IP and transmedia, that was unfathomable, 7-10 years ago, right? It was a dream. And now we're talking about the practical application of it. So I really appreciate the time and the deep dive.
Well, thank you, Peter, so much. You are a true ambassador, consul, spokesperson of the Finnish ecosystem in California and in around the world.
Proud to be.
So thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Jet lagged, but you killed it.
It was so much fun.
All right.
Anytime.
Thank you, everybody, for listening, and we're out.
All right.